about rain, a lot of writing about nature, which is great. Okay. All right, so let's do a quick breakdown of the actual like lesson itself. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the Foyle Young Poets competition. What is the competition? I know it's kind of a competition that a lot of people might have not heard about compared to, let's say, Scholastic. So we're going to introduce it a little bit. We're going to talk about some writing tips, things that you want to keep in mind in general while you're submitting your poetry, as well as kind of more specific tips for this competition in particular. We're going to do some practice looking at this through some winning
哥哥，
pieces,
妈妈给你发的那个书嘛，你也可以参加一下。
which will kind of,
放我一下，
um,
我演那个
sorry,
的，
can you
可以
mute?
啊。
Okay, perfect. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about brainstorming and how you can start like preparing your own ideas for the contest. So yeah, without further ado, let's begin. Oh, and let me just introduce myself really quickly. Some of you guys might know me, some of you guys might not. My name is Joanna. I teach the HS207 class here, and which is our creative writing and competition class, which is probably where a lot of you guys are coming from. And besides that, I also do a lot of kind of creative writing and mentorship beyond the group setting. So yeah. And I both participated in the Foyle Young Poets Award and also had experience mentoring students for it. So yeah, very excited to host this seminar and kind of talk about it in a more formal way, right? All right. So what exactly is the contest? I think it might be a little bit less well known. That's because the Foyle Young Poets Award is predominantly a UK-based competition, and is sponsored by the Poetry Society. However, they still are a very popular competition. And so, for example, last year there were almost 30,000 entries across, I think, 100 or so countries. It is the largest international poetry contest for students 11 to 17. And the really great thing about it is that, like, unlike Young Arts or unlike Scholastic, is that its age range is much more flexible. So I think a lot of younger writers and students have a better chance to kind of share their work or to talk about their work. The contest is judged by two poets. The poets change every year. This year, it's John McAuliffe and Rachel Long, who are both kind of poets and educators from the United Kingdom, and you can read more about them through that link there. Um, Across all of the submissions, these two judges will pull 15 top winners and 85 commended winners who all receive like different benefits, whether it's workshops or opportunities to attend an in-person ceremony or further mentorship and training opportunities. So winning Foyle, even if you're based in the US, can open up a lot of opportunities for you as a young writer. The only requirement for poems is that they must be English language and are 40 lines or less, and they cannot have been published or recognized elsewhere. And they include publications such as like publishing in a local place or posting to your social media. So they are a bit more strict than somewhere like Scholastic, where you can really submit anything, even if it's already won an award somewhere else. In the past, this used to be unlimited submissions. However, they've now limited it to one submission for international entries, and three for the UK, as they want to prioritize UK winners. And then the deadline is midnight, July 1st at British Standard Time. I want to emphasize that it's not Eastern Standard Time. British Standard Time is a couple hours ahead of Eastern Standard Time, so you should probably try and get your submissions in on the 30th, or early on in the day on the 31st, because it's probably going to close around, I think, like 7 p.m. EST. And you also want to prepare for any situation where a portal might crash, or things like that. So I would highly recommend, even though the deadline is the 31st, trying to get in or trying to finish your poems like earlier. And then you can submit online through their website. Here's some additional information, and I would highly, because this is shorter seminar, we aren't going to spend as much time talking about the specific judging process, tips from the judges, things like time going through and getting familiar with some of their materials. The Poetry Society does a really great job of making these resources available to students because their primary job is to kind of teach and educate. And so you will find a lot of good advice, whether that's about how to brainstorm a poem, how to revise a poem, and then how to prepare your poem for the foil contest. And so, yeah, I highly recommend you check out some of these. We've curated just some of them, but really they have like a ton of resources on their website. Okay. All right, so diving right into writing tips. It seems like a lot of you guys have written a poem before, so you know what's important in a poem. Um, and the important things that you want to think about in a poem are form, content, and language. Now we go into more detail on these in the actual course that we teach, HS207, but for if you're writing one of your first poems or you're just starting to think about poems, these are kind of a couple of really good anchor points to keep in mind. The first is form. So whether that is like using a specific type of poetry form, such as a sonnet, maybe you guys have read Shakespeare, a lot of that is in sonnets, a villanelle or a sestina or any other form, you want to make sure that you're following that form if you're using it. Form can also look like using line breaks, right? Poetry is really special and unique in that it's different from prose because you're not just thinking about a story, but you're also thinking about the language and the way you tell that story, right? So you want to be able to create interesting reading experiences. So the way your poem sounds or the way your poem looks on a page. And part of the way you can kind of create that variation and interesting reading experience is through lineation, which is basically just like how your lines look on a page, the balance of the black space of words with the white space of the page. You can think about line breaks. So, where do you choose to break a line? Do you choose to use end stop lines, which is where lines end at like a period or a comma, or do you choose to break them in an unusual way? You can think about variation in long and short sentences and also punctuation. We generally recommend avoiding super experimental forms. So maybe that's like shaping your poem in a really crazy way or using a particular format because in the past, the Foyle website doesn't really do a good job of allowing for really special forms to format well. And so you might find some difficulty with that. So for this competition, we recommend you kind of stick with stuff that's pretty simple. So think like free verse poetry basically or formal poetry like a sonnet. um, as you're reading or writing a poem, one thing that you also want to pay attention to besides form is how a poem feels. And one way we can kind of do that is to think about the rhythm of a poem or the spoken feel of a poem, right? A lot of us have learned about rhyme and rhyme schemes, but you can also create rhythm through other ways, right? Whether it's you're repeating a particular sentence structure, whether you are kind of using similar sounds, and that can help your poem flow in a really nice or very interesting way. And we'll get into some examples of that once we begin to look at some of the winning pieces here. You want to make sure you pay special attention to endings and beginnings and titles. If you're stuck on revising a poem, this might be a really good place to start. So, titles are especially important. I think a lot of people who first write poems don't fully think about titles because it kind of feels like, oh, I can just title it whatever the piece is about. Like if I wrote a poem about, let's look at some examples in the chat. If I wrote a poem about summer, I could title it Summer, right? But in reality, poem titles can add a lot to the meaning of the story and can even introduce new information that is not given earlier in the poem. So if you're new to poetry and you don't know how to revise or edit your poem, one way that you might want to work on editing that poem is by thinking a little bit about your title. Beginnings of a poem are also really important because that's how you introduce the piece, right? That's how you hook in your reader. That's how you get them thinking about like what the piece is about and like what your goal is in the piece. And so you want to have really strong opening lines, right? So for example, if I'm writing a poem about summer, I don't want to just start off with a line like it was summer, right? I want to open with a very specific image of like what my understanding of summer is like. Um, Next off, we also want to think about narrator voice. It's easy to think about the poem as something that's being written from your voice or your perspective, but what's really happening when you're writing a poem is you're kind of creating a narrator, similar to the way that you would create a narrator in a fiction piece or in a like creative like essay piece, right? So you want to think about whose perspective are you telling the story from in this poem, and then how does that affect the audience's perception of it? Um, another thing that's also important to keep in mind is this idea of taking leaps, right? You want your poems to be kind of thinking about ideas in unique and interesting ways. And a poem should be able to discuss things in many different ways that are specific and personal. So, what that means, for example, is that a good poem will not just talk about, let's say, let's look at some of these examples of what people have written about. Okay, someone said they wrote a nature poem. So a good poem won't just talk about nature, although that can be a very important part of it. It will talk about a specific narrator's understanding of nature, right? In a good poem, you want to avoid sentences that might be like, nature is very beautiful, right? Because that's something very broad and it feels like it's something that a lot of people could write. Instead, you want moments to feel very specific and very personal to you as a writer or to kind of the vision that you're trying to forward in a piece. Okay. Oh, and the slides will be sent out along with the recording after the lecture. So if you have any you'll be able to access these later. There's a lot of resources here. And then also if you have any questions that come up throughout this process, please just leave a comment in the chat because again, we're kind of condensing like what would normally be like 1 or 2 semesters worth of poetry content into like an hour long seminar. So there will be a lot of things that we don't go into more detail on. Okay. Writing patterns. So this is slightly different from the last slide. The last slide was just general things that you should keep in mind for any good poem. So like form, imagery, content, narration, how like building specific and personal images. These are things that after my personal observations, after going through probably like 20 to 50 pieces from the last like 4 or 5 years of competition and noticing like particular patterns. Most winning pieces are free verse poems. Do people know what free verse poetry is? And you can just write like a yes or no in the private chat. I kind of want to get a sense of what people's baseline understanding is. Okay, I'm seeing some yeses and nos, mostly yeses, but let's go over it really quickly. Free verse poetry is just any poetry that is written without a specific meter or line. Um, for example, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? That's written in iambic pentameter, right? Classic Shakespearean poetry. However, when we're thinking about free verse poem, that's probably more similar to what you might be writing in a classroom, where you aren't really thinking about the like rhyme or meter, basically that rhythm pattern that it has, and you also aren't specifically thinking about like AABB or like direct rhymes at the end of each sentence. And then a lot of these like free verse poems will also be like pretty standard, as in like it will be like one block of free verse text. Um, yeah. Someone said in the chat, free verse is like anything. It can be in any form or whatever you want. It doesn't have any rules, literally like a free verse. That's exactly it. And then for young art, sorry, for foil specifically, you'll see a lot of like free verse poems or just kind of like a block. Um, yeah. Um, One thing that you will notice about the Foyle Young Poets contest is that because it's a international or it's like a UK based contest, they will have more like instances of using like forms or like rhymed structures. So usually in HS207, when we're talking about submitting for Scholastic, we usually tell students to avoid forms like sonnets or villanelles unless they have a really specific or creative usage of it in mind. Because most American poetry tends not to prefer these types of forms. However, based on like my observations, I think UK poetry is a little bit more rigid or like is a little bit more kind of accepting of like stricter forms. So you'll see a lot of interesting forms winning, whether it's a villanelle or a triptych or something else. And I recommend you checking out the website to take a look. However, I'd say that most poems aren't super experimental. It's usually free verse, maybe broken up into some stanzas, but you'll see very little of kind of like super like creative forms, such as a contrapuntal, which we talked about last week in HS27, which is basically a poem with two columns that can be read side by side. I saw one contrapuntal when I was going through like 2 or 3 years of the contest, and something like a grid poem, which is a poem where each line is in a grid. And again, I didn't see any examples of that. So you might want to avoid super experimental things. Um, Patterns and imagery that I noticed for the contest include there's a lot of poems that use anaphora to begin stanzas. Um, Now, you'll see this kind of in any sort of poetic form, but I think especially in the type of poetry that is being written for foil, you'll see a lot more of this, or at least I saw a lot more of this when I was going through the winning entries. Another thing I noticed was a very inventive use of metaphor and simile. So, kind of an ability similar, honestly, this applies to any type of poetry, but I think especially for foil, they seem to really like it if you can describe something in a very interesting and specific way. So, again, we're trying to move away from descriptions like, um, I love my cat, or like, I think nature is great, and into stuff that is more specific, right? Nature is like a ball of Cheez-Its. Like something that feels, again, that was bad, right? But like something that feels more specific and interesting, and that your reader is like, "Oh, tell me more. I wasn't expecting you to make that connection," right? Another thing I observed is like people really lean into places, objects, and flora and fauna. So instead of saying like waiting at the train station, you might see someone saying like waiting for the Bakerloo train, which is like more specific, right? Things feel more grounded in a place. Instead of saying like she's drinking soda, you might see like she's holding a Mountain Dew. Instead of saying the flowers are blooming, you might see um, the dandelions and wisteria trees are blah 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 blah. Right? There's kind of people are leaning a bit more into like more specificity, which again plays into this idea of the specific and personal. Um, I think you also see like a lot of times poetry can like we see poetry that's like the title of it's like dog and the entire poem's like describing a dog. However, poems from Foyle do a really good job of kind of like maybe having one central imagery, but also being able to bring in a lot of unique comparisons, creating a sense of like, oh, there's a lot of like different elements going on, but they kind of all tie together. And then finally, I don't think this is true for all the pieces, but I notice a very strong sense of like the everyday. So these are just like kind of young writers who are talking about their everyday lives, the things that they see in their life. And of course, there is some exploration of like broader societal issues and like historical events, but I think there's also a lot of people kind of just stick to like, here's my day, here's what I think about X, right? Um, and then I will definitely say compared to like Scholastic, where you might see a lot more pieces about the exploration of like cultural heritage, identity, and that identity in relation to society, there's a lot more focus on the personal and the self. So whether that's like your relationship with yourself or your relationship with another person. And then finally, this is something that applies to both this contest, but also to, I think, honestly, any contest is an ability to kind of incorporate intertextual references or to bring in other sources. So oftentimes you'll see poems from the collection dedicated to another poet or to a film or to a specific event. And that might be an explicit reference, like maybe even in the title, or that could be a more implicit reference. Okay. Now, all of these are backed up with specific links to examples of these kind of more specific patterns. So, personal poems, if you want to kind of go through these on your own time, we probably won't right now, except maybe to give an example of what anaphora looks like. But there's a lot of personal poems, which are poems to an I or an other, which is usually a you in the poem. Sometimes it's not. There's a really cool kind of like subgenre of poems that just talk about like one idea or topic in different ways. So, for example, if we open The Smell of the Moon, it's just giving us a lot of specific and unique similes of like what the smell of the moon is like for this person. And notice how it's not just saying the moon smells like cheese or the moon smells like flowers, right? It's very specific in a way that feels very unique to this author. Um, and then another thing you'll notice is like that repeated use of a like, right? Or a simile structure. That's basically what we might call anaphora, right? It's a repeated sentence structure or a repeated beginning of sentence structure that kind of follows throughout the a lot of the piece or a majority of the piece. So here it's kind of that like comparison. Um Here are some, and I think again, it's pretty rare to see poems that do a lot in terms of structure, but here are some examples. Um, because mostly they are kind of like, here's an example of what is kind of more of what we would call like a prose poem, where it's kind of occupying, it looks like prose, but in the way it sounds and the way it feels to read, it feels a bit more like poetry. Um, Here's an example of a poem that uses really interesting like line break or lineation. This is kind of actually not how the poem is really formatted in the collection, but you can still see the kind of line breaks and what we would call lineation being used here as well. Um, Here are some examples of these anaphora poems where it's like, oh, there's using a repeat structure. And so you can see that he's got plans. I'm blinking. What's worse? I'm watching, I'm annotating, I'm wondering, he's got plans again. So it's almost structured like a song, which I think it might be alluding to. And you'll also notice here that there's a explicit reference to a person, right? Kurt Cobain. And also notice that the title is doing a lot of work because Kurt Cobain is never mentioned anywhere else in the poem, right? Okay. Here's just a couple examples, and you can spend more time looking at them here. Um, but the we thought these are all really good examples of like kind of these trends that we pointed out on this slide. And so it might be good to look at those if you want examples of what we mean by these patterns and imagery. Okay. All right. Now we're kind of entering a little bit of a participation section. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the piece aloud, and I'd love it if you guys could leave comments in the chat. They can be really quick, basically sharing what do you think this piece is doing well? What choices is it making in its form, in its beginning, ending, and title, in the imagery, and maybe the simile and metaphor it's using, things like that. Basically, just what we just talked about now. And I'll read the piece right now, and then I'll give people 1 to 2 minutes to make those comments. Okay, this is B. Unwin's Conversations in Bread Breaking, and it was a 2025 winner. Um, know that something is changing. Know that your body is less likely than ever to rip in the wind, fragile as tissue. And above all, that is a good thing. Know that all of your haircuts and braids down your back taught you the art of loss like a dance. The oil hisses and winks at you from the pan, an eye for an eye, the slack gaze of a mackerel's head scaled rough between your leather skin thumbs. Now, in the sharing of teeth, you may split yourself from your sorrow. The bread fits on your tongue like a storm cloud swelling. You are moth winged and pigeon toed, a hungry thing, sharply inelegant. You have taught yourself to wait, and now you crave it, don't you? The mouth feel. Go on, eat up the whole lot. Okay, 1 to 2 minutes to point out what you think this piece is doing well. And if you don't have a specific observation, you can think about, well, right off the bat, what sticks out to you, right? Quote, your favorite line or your favorite image. I just like a sense of people's initial reactions. Great, right? So some specific conversations people have had, some people have pointed out the repetition of the no. Um, and I think it does a really good job of kind of developing the no and using it to kind of bridge a lot of really interesting imagery, right? The first no that something is changing establishes that something is changing. And so we know that the next two no's are kind of going to be talking about that change. And because we're viewing the next two no's through that lens, the author has a lot more liberty to kind of play around with like different analogies and different explanations of change without explicitly needing to kind of use a basic example. Like, for example, like if the sentence had been, know that something is changing, you are taller now, that's like very generic and that's like kind of like a very expected image, right? However, because they kind of set up this framework of changing, we're able to view things like ripping in the wind and getting a haircut, or how that relates to change. And that kind of creates a more personal framing, right? Um, People really like the line breaking. Um, Yeah, I think the line break does a great job of emphasizing specific rhythms or emphasizing parts that are important. Um, People have talked about, someone said, you expect it to go bread, and said to yourself, yeah, in this line, now in the sharing of teeth, you may split yourself from your sorrow. And that's a good case where a line break can kind of create a new meaning in a poem, right? Um, Some people have mentioned sound. So definitely sounds like hiss and wink. There's like a lot of an S sound there, right? So there it kind of emphasizes the sizzling sounds you might hear in a kitchen. Someone mentioned the tone of the ending and kind of the commandingness of it, right? And that really speaks to an author who is very confident in their purpose and in like what they are able to do in a poem. And one thing we'll notice is that even though there's a lot of images, things are kind of tied together by the central idea of a conversation in bread breaking, which in this piece is kind of essentially like this idea of like growing up, learning to have conversations. And the beginning and ending kind of comes back to the idea of bread breaking, especially in the ending. Make sure I didn't miss any comments. The title, yeah. Someone pointed out the title, Conversations in Bread Breaking. If we were missing this title, a lot of this poem wouldn't make sense, right? We wouldn't fully understand why the ending of the piece is about eating bread. And we might not have the same framework for understanding like kind of the imagery of like cooking throughout, right? Um, for some references, fish is usually associated with bread. It's kind of like the biblical breaking of bread as well. And so I think we would be missing a lot without this title, right? And then conversations in bread breaking adds to both the conversational tone of this piece and also the kind of the title, right? It's not just bread breaking, it's a conversation in it. And so that adds to a little bit of the complexity in the title. So think about if this piece were titled bread or just bread breaking, that would have a very different effect. Okay, really great. I'm really happy with the observations we made here. Now we're going to try a little bit of a longer piece, which is a little bit less centered, but is still, well, it's both, it's another piece that's addressed to a speaker or a you, and it's another piece that is kind of thinking about that in a very specific way, and we're going to learn about that right now. So similar, again, leave comments or just talk about things you like or what's doing well. This is Cameron Colonzo's Congrats. I believe it is from the year 2023. Something good is happening to you. The sun doesn't ache like it used to, and the birds have stopped picking at your limbs. This is just a drill, and look, your life's love starting from rest, rubbing her eyes from across the Pacific. You haven't cried since your second to last birthday, and the show is within 30 miles, under $40. The helicopter's landing, and it's not an emergency this time. Less might not be more, and thank God there's more of you to touch. The fire in your name brand jacket has spread to the rest of your closet. You're out. Dad says hi, he'll call you after work. You're walking home alone, you're with a girl. She knows you and wants to keep in contact. Something good has happened to you. The backs of your eyelids aren't so black anymore. You've grown 2 inches. Your hands are manly rough. And they don't mind being idle once in a while. Tell your family, new and old, where you're going. Write home. Show off those killer arms. Okay, bit of a longer piece, but again, we'll give 1 to 2 comments to think about that and what choices it's making. Yeah, the theme of growing up is very strongly conveyed. Is anyone noticing any repetitions or kind of things that tie together the piece? Something I really like here is this kind of opening sentence in the first stanza of something good is happening to you. And then towards the end of the poem, it brings, yeah, right, something good is happening to you. That idea is repeated, right? That's almost like the thesis of the poem, and kind of repeating it in different ways emphasizes it. Yeah, no, but great observation. A lot of reassurance that the good is not fake. This is not a drill. It's not an emergency. Yeah, they're kind of, even though these images feel different from each other, they kind of fall into the same families of imagery, right? Which helps them stay cohesive, even though they're kind of like slightly different, right? There's kind of reference to emergency, like the helicopter, the fire in the jacket, the drill. What are some like specific images that we see throughout this piece? And then while people are answering that, I will say one of my favorite parts about this piece and why I chose it for this like workshop is that ending, right? Tell your family, new and old, where you're going, right home, show off those killer arms. I think that last line in particular really exemplifies what I'm talking about when I say, like, make a leap in your poetry, right? Take us just far enough that your reader wouldn't have made that connection without you there, but it still relates to your poem, right? And still resonates really well. For example, if that line, instead of show off your killer arms, had been like, write home, tell them about how much you've grown up, that wouldn't hit as hard for a lot of reasons. Um, Partially because your reader kind of already knows that. We've already talked about it. Partially because it isn't like interesting, right? We aren't kind of thinking about it. We're like, oh, we already know you've grown up. So show us another. Use a leap to kind of show how your narrator has grown up without saying it. The phrase "the birds have stopped picking at your limbs," definitely. There's kind of this idea of like getting picked at and like being able to kind of stand up for yourself. Um, and again, there's a lot of more generic images that could have gone there, but like such as like the birds have started chirping or the sun has started shining, right? But the specific tonal charge of the sun aching and the birds stopping their picking, that's kind of charged with this image of like kind of growing out of the growing pains or the discomfort of being a child. Yeah, and again, someone pointed out the you. The you is really important here because it really puts us very intimately and very directly into this person's perspective. As an experiment, when you're writing your own poems, one thing you can test out is seeing how your poem changes if you replace an you with an I, or an I with a me, or a me with a we, thinking about things how your poem reads differently if you change that perspective. Okay, we're going to move on to two prompts. Um, so conversations and bread breaking is basically a kind of a series of loosely associated metaphors all centered around the idea of bread breaking or kind of like growing up, right? So basically, for this prompt, you want to begin with a rough title focused on one premise, whether that's conversations in like bread breaking or notes on dandelions or letters to um like letters to snow days, right? um you want to kind of think about that category, whether it's bread breaking or something else, and think about themes as well as specific similes and metaphors that might fall under that premise. And we're really encouraging you to avoid all cliches, even just as the initial writing exercise to really push your language. And then the second prompt, inspired by congrats, is to write a poem addressed to a past or future version of yourself. So, what things have changed about you, your body, your interests, your hobbies, what you do, what you think about, and then what things have stayed the same. You can also think about what emotions you've associated with this version of you. So, in congrats, for example, there's very much this sense of like congratulatoriness, right? Or like joy, right? With this kind of newfound development, but also a sense of like it's like joy, but there's almost like a bit of irony in the saying, like, "Oh, congrats, you're fixed now because you're older," right? And again, similarly, you want to avoid cliches even in this rough draft. So if you find yourself describing anything like "I'm growing like a flower in bloom," cut that out. You want to think about really specific or really weird or really interesting images. Okay. And yeah, really push the boundaries of language if you can. Okay. I'm going to give people around 12 minutes to, let's start with 10 minutes to write. and then we'll take a minute or two to share. And I'll be sharing some of like some lines in the chat as well. So you can private message it to me and I'll kind of pick out some lines that I think are doing a good job or doing something interesting. And yeah, 10 minutes starting now. If you have any questions, just send a message in the chat. If you don't feel it, you don't have to. So punctuation, comma, em dashes, and signs, you can use whatever you want. Parentheses. Leave kind of like a couple minutes at the end if anyone has questions. So we'll say one more minute and then hit that timer. Okay, 30 seconds left. So you want to finalize what you have, even if it's not done, and send the chat. It can be privately directly to me. Um, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Okay, let's see what we have. Okay. And yeah, guys, this is like such a rough draft. I gave you guys like 10 minutes, and the fact that you're able to write anything is really impressive. So don't worry too much about it being perfect. Um, the whole purpose of this workshop is not to kind of come out with a fully formed draft, but to start thinking about the ideas or the things you might want to explore as the competition's due in a week. Just to start thinking about those things. Okay. Let me read some excerpts. Um, chili flakes into the pan. They pop like mahjong tiles clinking together. Um, line them up on the counter, neat and organized. Follow the recipe. I love the title, The Return of the Rosin Eaten Violins. That's really funny. I don't usually think of violins as rosin eaters, so I love that description. You kind of turn something that's like very ordinary into something that's very menacing. And I like that a lot. Um, painting my nails aubergine. I like the color.
Can I share a link, please?
Oh yeah, go for it.
Sure, no
Um,
problem. Okay, so here's the link.
As you strike each line, each curve in the white, you do within a complexity that turns. Oh, what does strike all cliches from our vocabulary mean again? It basically just like if you find yourself kind of like describing a something as like yellow as a banana or something that's like the first thing that comes to mind, like love is like a rose. Basically, it's just kind of shorthand for saying like you want to avoid the first association that comes to mind for a thing and try to think up more unique or personal images. Um, there's a lot. They're really great ones. The keys click like smooth river stones underneath your fingertip. Our pinkies looping in a chain linked fence. Um, there's a, there's a lot, which is great. Okay. Um, and then I want to leave some room for people to ask any questions about the competition or about poetry in general. Um, Reminder that this is due on July 31st, and also that if these prompts didn't feel like enough for you and you want to kind of look at some more prompts, I would really recommend, well, number one, the Foyle website has specific resources for young writers here. Um, and they'll give you a ton of different prompts depending on like very specific things you want to do. But also, the adult version of the Foyle Young Poets competition is just called the like National Poetry Competition, and they also have a lot of prompts. So I think that's also linked in the slides, but these are very specific prompts, right? So if there's anything specifically here or here or here that kind of like you're drawn towards, like, oh, maybe you want to write about hands, or maybe you want to write about um, something that you would usually never write about, then you might want to check some of these out. Um, but yeah, other than that, that's basically everything we have for today. I want to leave a couple minutes for people to ask questions and also for us to transition over because we have a class after this. But yeah, if you weren't able to catch the full lesson or if you missed the class, there will be a video recording of this workshop as well, where you can follow along with our discussion and also with our analysis of the poems. I'm just wondering, how can we make the meaning clear under something simple or complex? Because some of these poems are confusing. Do we want to make it confusing? Yeah, I think poetry is about finding a balance between being straightforward and also kind of like making your reader work for the meaning. So I think a piece can be complex, as in it has a lot of moving parts that might not make sense right away. But also, when you kind of finally figure it out, those parts like kind of click together or it makes sense like that. I almost think writing a poem is like solving a puzzle, and you're kind of asking your readers to solve the puzzle. So you won't always be saying like directly what you mean. Okay. Any other questions? And if not, you're free to head out. If you're in HS27, you can stay. Because hopefully you can come to class. Um, and yeah, let me know if you have any other questions. And if you have questions but you don't want to ask them right now, or you can always reach out to me at my email, which is joannalou47@gmail.com. But yeah, I'm seeing a lot of really awesome poems here. Thank you guys so much.